Yes, you read that title correctly, and yes, this is going to be a whole video talking about the way we remove games from our Nintendo consoles. Now, in hearing that, I'm sure there are some of you who might think there is enough material to make an entire video about eject buttons, but I honestly think you'll be surprised at how far the Nintendo eject button rabbit hole goes. So just stick with me for a little while as we dive deep into one of the weirder and not so often talked about features of Nintendo's famous gaming consoles. First off, we've got to set our time machines way back to the great year of 1983. The year Nintendo released their insanely popular family computer, or Famicom, to the Japanese market. Due to its catalog of fun and addicting games, eye-catching design, and overall great word of mouth, the Famicom would go on to sell nearly 20 million units in Japan. To put that in perspective, the population of Japan at the time of the Famicom's peak was around 120 million people. That means that on average, 1 in every 6th person in Japan owned a Famicom. Those are some crazy numbers that Nintendo wouldn't see again on a home console in Japan for quite some time. The Famicom has its fair share of eccentric design choices, from the hardwired-in bright red and gold controllers to the questionable and slightly confusing name choice. But in my opinion, the weirdest feature of the Famicom would have to be the giant red slider-like switch found right smack dab in the middle of the console. As I'm sure you've already realized, this large red slider is our quote-unquote eject button in this case. And not only does it look a little weird, the way this particular eject switch functions is probably the weirdest of any console Nintendo has ever produced. When you push that giant red nose the Famicom has forwards along the track, what you're actually doing under the hood is push 2 large triangular wedges of plastic forward. These wedges are designed in such a way that they will slide under a cartridge and gradually lift it up as you push further and further, eventually freeing it from the console's pin connector. At which point you'll release the switch, and it will slide back into its initial position thanks to a spring inside the console. Definitely a rather odd approach to an eject button if you ask me. Also, if you've ever wondered why the Famicom cartridges have a slight incline on either side of the cartridge, this was most likely put in place to more easily allow the wedges to get underneath of them. The Famicom method of ejecting a cartridge works as designed, and you can even argue that it works really well for a first foray into console manufacturing. However, if you're an avid retro game collector like myself, I recommend that you refrain from using this feature of the Famicom if you have the option. Why is that, you might ask? Well, when you use the slider to eject a cartridge from your Famicom, you're actually causing some damage to the underside of your game. This damage is caused by the fact that the triangular wedges rub up against the cartridge as you push them forward. Pretty much every Famicom game I own has some evidence of abrasion where the wedges would have come into contact with the game. Obviously, this isn't going to destroy your game or anything like that, but over time you could find yourself with a rather scratched up cartridge if you're not careful. So I'd say go with the caveman method of just pulling the cartridge out with your bare hands for Famicom games. And for those of you thinking you might damage your game by pulling the cartridge out this way, don't worry. The eject lever was an idea proposed by a well-known designer for Nintendo, Yokoi Gunpei, because he thought kids would get a kick out of it. You have to remember that before they were a video game company, Nintendo spent a number of decades as a toy and card game company, so this sort of mindset among designers isn't really that big of a surprise to me. So as long as you're careful, there really isn't anything to worry about when pulling a cartridge out directly. Case in point, the N64, which has no eject feature, but still uses cartridges very similar to those on the Famicom. But I think that's enough about the family computer. Let's move on to its Western counterpart, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. If you were someone who knew absolutely nothing about Nintendo, you might think that the Japanese and Western versions of Nintendo's first console would be quite similar. But as we know now, that is not even close to the reality of the Famicom and the NES. The NES, which released in October of 1985, was much larger than the Japanese Famicom, had a different visual aesthetic, and featured a wide variety of hardware-level changes. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, the NES doesn't really have an eject button in the traditional sense. However, I would like to talk about the loading tray mechanism found on the NES, because I believe it's quite similar to an eject button in the way it's used. The NES loading tray, as the name implies, is a tray you load a cartridge into when you're ready to play. You would push the cartridge all the way in until it sits snugly in the 72-pin connector, and then go on to push the loading tray down into its ready position. When you're done playing, you simply press down on the game again, and it pops back up, very similar to how you eject games on some of Nintendo's other consoles. It's a simple spring-loaded mechanism that doesn't really require much explanation. However, there is something that I'd like to mention about this loading tray push-down-to-play design Nintendo decided to go with. That is that what you're actually doing when you push your game down is bend the cartridge pins into place so they come into complete contact with the pin connector. That allows you to actually play your favorite game. Now this is all fine and good in the short run, but over time this will wear on your cartridge's pins, as well as on your NES's 72-pin connector. The NES is probably the Nintendo console which is most often in need of repair due to this very fact. Most of the time, the 72-pin connector will have its pins bend out of place eventually, which essentially puts the console out of commission until you open it up and repair it. Nintendo has stated that they went the front-loader route over the more tried-and-true top-loader design for the NES because they thought it would resemble the at the time very popular video cassette recorder, as well as serve to make the console stand out from the crowd. They were also concerned that in some of the drier American states, that there could be some issue with static electricity, and a front-loader design would make things a little safer for the kiddos handling this potentially dangerous piece of electrical equipment. We know now that top-loaders work just fine in America, but at the time it was a real concern. However, this means that we have to live with the fact that more likely than not, our NESs are going to stop working at some point due to the bending factor of the front-loading mechanism. There are some third-party pin connectors that solve this problem, but they're not exactly reliable either. You could just bend your connector's pins back into place, and that would work just fine, but then they'll just bend back eventually anyway. If I'm being honest with you, if you're looking to buy an NES, just get yourself an AV Famicom. They are top-loading, have detachable controllers, enhanced audio, and come with the widely used Nintendo AV out port on the back. If you pick up a 72-pin to 60-pin converter, you can even play your NES games on them as well. So you really can't beat the AV Famicom in my opinion. And speaking of top loaders, next up we have the ever-popular SNES and Super Famicom. The SNES and Super Famicom are extremely similar in the way you eject cartridges, so I'm going to lump them into one group here. But don't misunderstand. The SNES and Super Famicom's eject mechanisms are actually quite elegantly designed, if just a little bit simple. The Super Famicom released first on November 21st, 1990, with the SNES following just a few months later on August 23rd, 1991. Since the two released in such close proximity to one another, it makes a lot of sense that they would share a lot of design ideas, which they of course do. And this includes the ejecting mechanism, which is actually very button-like in this case. In fact, in the case of the Super Famicom, it really is a button. When you want to remove a cartridge, you simply press the large eject button down, and the cartridge pops right off the pin connector. But how does that actually work? Well, in this case, we aren't using those weird wedges or a strangely designed loading tray. We're using a seesaw. Yeah, like the ones kids love to play on at the park. It's a very simple design, but it works great for the purposes of ejecting stuff. So as you might have already surmised, when you push down the eject button, you're really pushing down one side of the seesaw, which raises the other side. And on this other side, there are two small foot-like protrusions that, when raised, stick up into the cartridge holding area just enough to lift your cartridge off the pin connector. Like I said, it's actually really simple in this case. But it works, and as far as I've seen on my Super Famicom games, there really isn't any need to worry about damaging your cartridges by using the eject button in this case. And that goes for the SNES as well. The only difference between the Super Famicom eject button and the SNES eject button is that instead of pushing down on a button that then pushes down on one end of the seesaw, you're just pushing down the seesaw directly on the SNES. But other than that, it's all the same, so hopefully you can see why I grouped these two together. Personally, I prefer the feel the eject button on the Super Famicom gives over the more direct approach on the SNES. Not only does it feel more satisfying to push down on a button, it makes for a cooler looking design to the console in my opinion. Like I said earlier, the N64 sadly has no eject button, so we'll be skipping right over that one and onto the Nintendo Gamecube. The Gamecube released back in late 2001 in both Japan and North America, and was the first mainland Nintendo console to use disc-based media for its games. This change was a welcome one for many fans and developers alike, due to the much larger storage capacity afforded to us by the Gamecube game disc. However, since they were no longer using cartridges, Nintendo had to come up with a new way to eject their games from the console. You couldn't really use a big seesaw or triangular wedge to pop discs out, because that would very likely cause damage to the much more fragile game disc. So what did they come up with? Well, it's kind of a two-pronged mechanism. When you push down on the round center piece in the GameCube's disc tray that's used to rotate the disc, the round metallic balls that hold down the disc will retract enough to free the disc, while three square pieces of plastic that are pushed down flat when inserting a disc will pop up, thus lifting the disc over the metal balls, where it is then held in place until you remove it. Definitely a lot more complicated than a seesaw with feet. I'm pretty sure I didn't even know this feature existed as a kid since the push text is written in such small font. You can just rip the disc right out of the GameCube rather easily, but it's possible to crack your disc this way if you're too careless. Speaking from experience here. You can also put your disc in more safely if you hold down the middle button and push the game down. It's honestly not as big of a deal as when you take it out, because it's easier to more evenly push the game in than it is to take it out, but that's just something to consider if you care about game preservation. The two home consoles that follow the GameCube, the Nintendo Wii and Wii U, both use a very similar method for the ejecting of games, so I'll be talking about them in tandem as well. The Wii, which released in late 2006, marked the first time Nintendo would use full-size discs for their games. And that meant that they would once again have to come up with a new way to eject their discs from the console. However, in this case, there was already a precedent in place for how to accomplish such a task thanks to the many DVD, CD players, and other gaming consoles that had already been released by this point. But, as I did some digging around online, one thing I couldn't really find any information on was how exactly Nintendo and these many other companies went about doing this. So I took matters into my own hands and disassembled one of my old Wiis so I could get some insight into this process. And from what I could tell, it's actually a pretty simple idea that was just about what I was expecting it to be. So, when you push down the eject button, a motor that is connected to a series of gears begins to spin up. The last of these gears is attached to an axle of sorts that has a rubber belt wrapped around it. And it's this belt that actually pushes the disc in and out. Pretty simple, right? It's just a spinning rubber bar that grips the game and pulls it in or pushes it out depending on the circumstances. Now, I didn't physically disassemble my Wii U because I only have one and I don't want to break it, but I'm pretty sure it uses a very similar concept, if not the exact same mechanism. I'm sure there are a lot of you out there who might be thinking, but Ack, you skipped over the handhelds. Well, don't worry, Jimmy. I just saved them for last because the Nintendo handhelds with eject features all work in the exact same manner. Nintendo's DS line of consoles, as well as their latest Switch console, all use very similarly sized and shaped game cartridges. It's really the only option if you want to use cartridges on a handheld, so it's not really anything surprising, I guess. I'm not sure if any of you out there have ever taken a good look around a Nintendo DS or Switch cartridge, but the first time I gave one a good look, the thing that stuck out the most to me were these two notch-like indents on the side of each one. And as it turns out, these two notches are actually connected to the ejecting of the cartridge from the console. If we take a look around inside of a DS or Switch cartridge slot, we can see that there is a sliding switch-like mechanism on one side of it that corresponds to the notches on the cartridge. The bottom notch pushes down on the slider to actually bring it into its locked position, while the upper notch is there to prevent the cartridge from falling out, thanks to a retractable metal arm also attached to the slider. When you push down on your cartridge to eject it, you're releasing the spring-loaded slider from its locked downward position, and so it snaps back up to the top, bringing the cartridge with it. Now at this point, the cartridge is still technically held in by the metallic arm, but that's only there to prevent it from falling out and will retract when you attempt to pull your game out of the system. Like on the Wii and Wii U, this mechanism isn't really anything new, as there have been many spring-loaded cartridge slots on a number of different electronics for things like SD cards for many years now, but still pretty interesting to actually get in there and figure out how this stuff works. And I think that pretty much wraps up this edition of Ack Goes Way Too Deep into a really specific topic. Hopefully you guys found this video interesting and maybe even came to appreciate the depth of eject buttons just a little bit more. I know I did. If you did enjoy the video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. Don't worry, Jimmy. Eject Man's here to save the day. I'll send these bad guys packing with my spring-loaded spring punch. I even cringed myself out with that one.